Welcome. Kenneth and me actually talked about it before, and we decided to do it in English in order to avoid that 10% of my brain capacity is busy with the Swedish grammar rules. So I hope that works for everyone. We will make sure that we have a bit of time for questions also in the end, and then we can gladly take that in Swedish. So that's no problem. Yes, welcome. So as the invitation said, we want to, or would like to use the time to present our robotics journey, which we have done at Nordea for 3.5 years now. We will make sure to cover, so to say, how we have started, why we have started, how it has evolved, what important milestones were, decisions we took along the way, or which we didn't take, or we should have taken, and then also how we organize today, what output we produce, and a little bit of an outlook of our next to-dos, our next focus for the coming year or so. Yes, but before jumping into the content, so who are we, are you probably wondering? So my name is Jan Tumme. I'm at the moment co-heading the Robotics Center of Excellence at Nordea. Then I'm also heading the robotics strategy and methodology team, which we will hear a little bit more about later. I have a Swedish-German background, studied and worked in both countries, worked both first in the shipping industry for a couple of years and now the last 5 years at Nordea in transaction banking in different positions, and now since a while ago at Nordea Robotics.
Yes, my name is Hampus Gallak. I have some German background as well, but that's far back in time. I'm working as a senior execution lead, so I'm actually trying to execute and make sure we have the robots working in production and taking the ideas into robots. I've been at Nordea for almost 6 years now, working with various IT development and business strategies and so on. So I think me and Jan are doing this really good together, and I'm focusing mainly on Sweden, but we're working in all the 4 Nordic countries, as you will see.
Okay, so just to give you a little bit of a glance of where are we today. So what's the output we deliver for Nordea as a company? What is the scope of all of this? But also what is the complexity which we have already started to build with our robotics unit, på gott och ont, as you say in Swedish. So during the last 3.5 years, we have managed to robotize 300 processes in totality, and those 300 processes then executed by robot users or digitala medarbetare, as Kenneth said. They have, during 2018, from January until end of October, November numbers we don't have yet for obvious reasons, so until end of October, they have given back to business 260,000 hours. So what do we mean with that? We mean that the 2.9 million cases which those robot users have executed on behalf of Nordea or instead of somebody doing it manually, that has a value of 260,000 hours of manual handling, which it had otherwise taken. So that's kind of the value which robotics in Nordea has created from January until October during 2018. And all of that was created by 130 people at Nordea working with robotics. So you can see there's quite a lot of output, and this really is a very good business case, but there's also an investment to it. We'll come to that later, that robotics can make a lot of sense, but it's not for free. And Nordea is really investing in this and is also creating a lot of output. Yes, then it's quite easy to bring up such a slide now with those big numbers, but it has really been a journey. It has been a struggle, and Kenneth also said that many learned it the hard way, and I think we were one of them. So we had to overcome many challenges in regards to technique, politics, communication internally, internal understanding, getting our business units, so to say our internal customers on board, internal anchoring, it could be anything. So we have really gone through a lot of challenges, and we still do. Sometimes it feels like every day is just challenges, but then once in a while, and this is probably a good opportunity to remind oneself that we also achieve something here. As a summary, we can say that robotics can make a lot of sense, but it's not easy, and it's often actually more difficult than expected in the beginning, especially when trying to scale it to a professional level. And there Kenneth had the slide of like industrializing, institutionalizing. And when reaching that level, then it's really when it starts to be complicated. So while it can make a lot of sense, it must be a conscious decision to start this and also to really think about how how to do things, both in the initial phase and then along the way. Good. So why did we get started in the first place? 3.5 years ago, that was a pretty straightforward reason, and that was basically, I hope you're able to read it. That was basically to reduce costs, or at least the hope to reduce costs. That was the promise behind this technology. And when a couple of people started at Nordea, that was the main focus. We think, okay, this could be a possibility to reduce costs. Then a little bit along the way, we have, so to say, learned that actually robotics makes sense for more aspects, and we should start for more reasons. For example, that our customer expectations are changing, that the market around us is changing, and that robotics can be a help to stay competitive and to stay quick and fast and so on with those new customer expectations. So we started for one reason, but we realized, okay, there's actually more to it why we should start. And then even further along the journey, we realized further benefits. Those were, for example, fulfilling regulatory requirements, where robotics can be a help. A famous case is GDPR, for example, where a robot can typically help to collect information from different systems instead of doing that manually. Robotics can help to achieve quality and speed. And also that we, and Kenneth also touched upon that, that we see that it can take away administrative burden and enable our colleagues to refocus on the work which they were actually hired to do, to actually do the value-adding work instead of doing, so to say, the admin tasks, which increase and increase. So we see we started for one reason, which was a little bit the promise behind the technology, but now in the retrospective, we should have started for many of those reasons, and it's really the totality of those reasons which makes robotics attractive. So then assume we have started now. What were the important milestones on our journey during the last 3.5 years? Super high level, can say that during 2015, there was a few pioneers in Nordea who started robotics completely decentral. They were interested and they had, or tech interested, and they had probably a little bit of a cost pressure. So they started to look into this, but it was really on a POC, pilot level, and quite small scale. Then in 2016, things started to take off or to get traction. I think it was something around 20 robotized processes or something around that, but still completely uncoordinated. However, the only coordination or the only alignment which we luckily achieved from day one was that we all used one platform. So we have all used Blue Prism from day one. But besides that, people had different ways of working, different understanding of robotics, different methodologies. I think we even used different consultancy companies to help us. So that's, of course, also from a procurement point of view, not so super clever. But anyway, we got started. And then in the beginning of 2017, senior management, so say, pulled the handbrake and said, okay, this technology seems to make a lot of sense. This seems very promising, but we cannot have small robotics teams popping up everywhere in the organization like mushrooms. But instead, we need some kind of central alignment. So then the Robotics Center of Excellence, which we represent here, was created. And at the same time, so to say, the robotics journey continued to robotize processes. But then really during 2017 second half, the Center of Excellence focused very much on this organizational alignment, getting one methodology in place, one way of working, one way of reporting benefits, one understanding of what are our virtual resources which are needed. We come to that. So that was the focus of 2017 second half. And then 2018, we continued, now you get the picture, we continued to further scale, further robotize, but also we understood more and more that we need to come away from this pure cost-saving focus, but rather look at the totality of the benefits. We mentioned quality, speed, enabler to achieve regulatory requirements and so on, and also understand fully the costs which are connected to robotics, which we will see later. And then we work with our internal efficiency and a little bit of simplifying our internal setup. So those are the high-level milestones of our last 3.5 years.
Yes, and as Jan has showed you, it has been a journey. It has been a little bit ups and downs along the way. But we would like to sort of highlight 5 key factors, as we see it, to why we can be able to stay here and show you that amazing slide in the beginning, to be proud and stand here. So 5 key factors that we see is important. Of course, you need to select the right process. It's crucial to select the right ones. So I want to talk a little bit about that. We also want to talk a little bit about the ways of working, how we organize, but frankly, how we are working in our daily lives when we are trying to robotize, we think is a key factor. We also want to talk a little bit about the organization. As Jan mentioned, we started with satellites here and there in the organization, and now we have a center of excellence and so on. So that is also something we maybe took a decision, or we started in one way, changed that along the way, and we basically have tried it all, I think. We also want to talk a little bit about collaboration, because this can't be achieved by a few couple of persons. It needs to be a good collaboration between basically everyone in the bank, but you need to be strong on the collaboration to be able to get this up to speed and actually starting generating some benefits. And finally, we also want to talk, as Jan also mentioned a couple of times, the investment. It is not for free. There is a cost to be able to do this. But first of all then, selecting the right process. In the beginning, it's super easy, and you should try to use a simple way of identifying a process. It could be the simple business prioritization matrix, where you have the volumes or the numbers on one axle, and then the complexity on the other one. And to just cherry pick the easy processes, the right ones to do the first time. And I think you should do that. But if you really want to take robotics to the next level, and be able to, as Kenneth showed, take it to the industrialized level or institutionalize, we don't really think this is enough, because there's a risk if you do like this, you end up with a portfolio that is extremely messy. You have a lot of processes here and there in the organization, different types of IT applications you're working in, different stakeholders to keep happy and satisfied. There's also a risk that you pick one process here, one here, instead of trying to fully automate the whole main process. That, of course, makes it hard to maintain. You're building a lot of complexity in terms of maintaining your portfolio. So definitely think you should start with the business prioritization model, as we did, or matrix, as we did. But quite soon, you need to come up with a strategy for your pipeline, for what kind of processes to focus on, because otherwise you will end up with this messy portfolio. So you should have a clear understanding in the organization to what strategy you have for RPA or robotics. It can be focus on cost, as we did in the beginning. It can be quality, it can be regulatory, it can be several of them, but you should have a clear strategy for what to focus on. And then I think the second part that is important is to maybe go in and do a focus on some part of the organization rather than try to cover it all from the beginning, because then you will end up like this, a little bit here and there, but rather do a focus on, I don't know, operations or the economic department or something to try to do end-to-end robotization instead of a little bit here and there. Because hopefully then you will get a more well-combined portfolio of processes that is, you have the knowledge about that area you're working with, that part of the organization. That part of the organization is already aware of robotics. There is an acceptance about robotics in the organization, which will make it so much easier to start. And of course, if everyone is accepting robotics in that part, you have the knowledge about the IT application in that part of the organization. The startup cost for robotizing there is much lower, which is always nice. Of course, all the maintenance, as we touched upon, it's so much easier if you have fewer applications, fewer stakeholders to keep happy. And finally, if you are focusing on fewer processes, it's so much easier to actually make an impact, to change the organization. Otherwise, you end up here and there without really being able to harvest the benefits. So selecting the right process, start simple, but try to quite soon, if you want to scale up, to have a strategy on how to actually utilize RPA or robotics. The second one, ways of working. quite early in the beginning when we established the Center of Excellence, we decided to work agile. And it's a buzzword, I know, but it has really helped us to get where we are today. I want to highlight 4 different factors in an agile way of working that we think is super important and a good reason to why we are here today. And the first one, we try to focus on the individuals and interactions between the different persons in the sort of project to robotize a process, rather than have the right processes and tools and so on. So the human interaction, we think, was a key factor to take us here. Second, we focused on working robots. This sounds so silly to say, but it's true, because we really wanted to get the robot out in production, generating benefits, rather than spending tons of time on doing comprehensive documentation, signing it off here and there with everyone in the bank. So working robots, take that with you. Again, collaboration with the business. You need to have the buy-in from the business side, both the SMEs that you're working on that have the knowledge about the process you're about to robotize, but also you need the support from top management, but also from middle management in order to do this. Otherwise, they're just thinking the robots are coming to take their jobs. That's not the case. We want to free up time to support. So rather that than a strict project governance, to spend tons of time setting up steer codes and so on to take the right decision, but a better collaboration with the right persons to have them involved. That was a key. And finally, instead of maybe doing a strict time plan or how to robotize or how to do this and so on, we decided to be very agile and respond to change, to shift focus whenever we saw that, okay, this doesn't make sense, this is much better to do. So be that really agile organization. I think that is also crucial. Of course, there's much more to agile, but I really think that is a big factor to why we are here today.
Yes, coming to the third point. But how to then set up an organization or a robotics capability in an organization? We talked about pipeline way of working and how to then actually structure it. And there's, of course, many ways of slicing a cake, and I can say that we have tried several of them. Very straightforward would, of course, be that you have one team in the organization, in your company, which is responsible for robotics as such, basically doing it all. And the other extreme would be to have a completely decentralized setup with different smaller robotics teams in different parts of your company. That is basically, or was our starting point, as I said earlier. So those are 2 possibilities. But then there's actually also 2, so to say, in-between versions. And that is that you can either have a hybrid setup or what we call a hub and spoke. And that is how we are organized today. So both in a hybrid and in a hub and spoke setup, you have a center of excellence in the middle. And then you have decentral robotics teams around it. The center of excellence in the middle typically has the theme ownership for robotics, or the conceptual ownership for robotics. That can include, and it can include a lot of things, but just to mention a few, that can include a common definition of robotics, a common understanding on our methodology, our way of working. It is one platform, which then typically a center of excellence would own. At least that's the way it is in our case. It is a central unit responsible for everything around compliance, operational risk connected to robotics, and also instructions and guidelines in regards to different topics, for example, virtual resources. It is so that you, besides the platform, let's say Blue Prism is this example, you also need a couple of technical components. And it's quite clever to have instruction and guidelines around that, how they should be used, who should pay for them, because otherwise you will end up after a year or so in 10 different setups. And then having those sort of decentralized teams, as we have it at least, that means we call them satellites. So those are small robotics teams in the different areas, and they have their own RPA developers, their own RPA controllers. So they configure robots, they own their own projects, they own their own pipeline, and they also run their robots afterwards. But they always follow the guidelines and the instructions from the Center of Excellence, and they do it, so to say, on the one common platform. So this is a setup which we have chosen, and we have really gone from decenter via hybrid to this current hub and spoke. There's, of course, advantages, disadvantages with it, but at the moment this works quite well because we have the central ownership, the central coordination, and at the same time we also have those teams being very close to the respective units they operate in. So that can be an interesting in-between version. Taking it one step further, how to then sort of say organize one robotics unit or team. And that of course depends very much on the size of that team and that unit, and not saying that we have sort of say completely figured it out, but just as an inspiration, how have we organized our center of excellence? We basically have been thinking about our value chain of what do we actually do. We lay the tracks, so say kind of enable that we can robotize all the having the platform, having certain guidelines, having sign-offs from compliance units internally, and all the things which are needed. Then we, so say, build the trains, we build the robots, and then we run the trains, we run the robots. So that's how we have organized our Center of Excellence, where we have a robotics strategy methodology team, so being responsible for laying the tracks, enabling the foundation. Then we have an execution team, which is essentially a small team of pipeline hunters and project managers who, so say, are the bridge between the business, our customer, and our robotics guys who actually configure the robots. Then we have robotics development, so those who actually configure the robots, which is in our case by far the largest team or the largest part with 3 teams, which are all called Team 1 on the slide. It's a different story. And then when you have configured your robots, when they enter production, then you actually have to run them. So that is what we call robotics operations. So those guys are responsible for scheduling the robots, controlling that everything is working fine, easier maintenance, and especially also the contact to business, so the contact to our internal customers. So we want them to almost be like a relationship manager, that they take a full responsibility in the, so to say, daily operations when robots are up and running. And then we have 2 small IT teams, which help us with respective parts. One team helping us with improving the underlying infrastructure, and one small IT team helping us with running the underlying infrastructure and doing fixes. So they help with laying the tracks and they help with running the robots. There's many ways of doing this, and there's many advantages, disadvantages, but that's at least how we have done it now, and works quite well at the moment. So just as an inspiration. Yeah, and then on this one I will be rather quick, both because of time, but also I think we could probably spend an entire presentation just on this. Collaboration. So our experience is that this really works out when business, so to say, again, our end customer, the robotics unit and IT are actually working together. And their robotics can be a good bridge between business and IT, making sure that at the end the receiver of the robotization product is satisfied, but also that IT helps with the underlying infrastructure. I mentioned the 2 teams which help us there. And also that IT doesn't see robotics as a competitor or as a rival, but rather that they see it as a complement, which can help out each other, which can, and Kenneth had the slide, which can take the smaller parts, which IT probably never has time, budget, or resources for. And then just 2 additional points that, of course, as with many topics, top management, alignment, or anchorship is very important, so that you actually have somebody who sort of say stands up for this topic when the heat turns up, and because there will be challenges, so it's very important to make sure that we actually want to do robotics. Otherwise, it's difficult to come out of the pilot phase. And to enable this push and pull, so that it's not just a robotics unit which is super excited about the technology and wants to robotize. You also need to have business units in your organization who want to do this. Because otherwise it's constantly robotics knocking at the door and asking if we could robotize something. It should rather be push and pull, that they also want to do it. And that is a lot about understanding, that's a lot about maybe them having a target, or also them having time to actually do this. Yes, and then we have talked a lot around investment. So there's sometimes a misperception that robotics is for free, or at least very, very cheap. It's certainly not as expensive as IT, but we think it's important to highlight that robotics is not for free, and it's not for free forever. And what do we mean with that? We mean that when you decide to robotize a process, there's a project cost or development cost. And then after that, you have a platform cost, because you need to have some technical components in the platform in place. Virtual resources, I mentioned that, and operations costs. So we have this team which actually makes sure that the robots are running, that they're scheduled, and so on. So robotizing a process, you will create fixed costs forever, even if that process only does very, very few cases. So it's really important to think about, okay, does it make sense that I robotize this and thereby create fixed costs forever, or at least as long as this process is live? And how to make sure that, of course, a good business case, what actually benefits you want to achieve. And again, that doesn't just have to be cost savings. It could be other benefits, but just to be very aware that there are good benefits. Making sure the funding is established, who pays for what, according to which split key. So that's pretty good to talk about that before you do something, because afterwards nobody wants to pay typically. And then, of course, efficiency, to really make sure that your robotics capability, your robotics teams are running very efficient, both in the way of working, but also how we use our virtual resources. Because otherwise costs can easily go off and the business case might not be as good as you think. And one component here can be nearshoring, and Kenneth mentioned the office in Łódź with both Digital Workforce has, and also we in Nordea have that. So it can be an idea to nearshore certain parts of your robotics value chain. And then, of course, in order for the business case to make sense at all, you need to make sure that at the end you actually harvest the benefits, whatever they are. Again, it doesn't just have to be cost savings, but to actually, whatever benefits you intended to have, to make sure that you get them, because otherwise you just created fixed costs.
Yes, so that was the sort of the past, how we ended up where we are today. But we also want to talk a little bit about the future. What are we going to focus on going forward? A little bit short term, but also in the longer term to take robotics in Nordea to the next step, or maybe rather take it from robotics to automation, because that's actually what we're aiming for. But first of all, with this great power that we actually have now in Nordea, because we are having quite a lot of power and execution power, but also we're making a difference in the bank, because we are having a lot of digital colleagues actually. With that power comes also some risks, being this big. So we first of all need to make sure that we have those risks under control. So that's what we're spending a lot of time on right now, to being more efficient on that. And now, Kenneth, I can see that some pictures are missing. That's
so now it's freestyle.
Yeah, that's interesting. But okay, we'll try. So with being this big, it is a big risk. We see that having 300 robots in production means that we are generating a lot of benefits every day, and we are dependent on those robots in our daily work. We realized that a couple of weeks ago when we had some downtime in one of our databases, that basically meant that 300 of our digital colleagues were sick. They couldn't generate any benefits. That, of course, affects us quite a lot. Another factor is that we already have a quite complex infrastructure or IT application landscape in Nordea, and the nature of robotics is that you're adding a layer on top of that. So that, of course, means that you're building even more complexity. So you need to be aware of that. I think you can go to slide like 19, 17. Perfect. Complexity. I remembered. As I said, we have a complex landscape as it already is, and we're adding a layer on top of that. That makes it complex, even more complex. So you need to be aware of that and how to attack that, so to say. And what we're trying, or will try to do, is to, as Jan touched upon, harvest the benefits. And of course, one of our benefits is the cost saving, but we feel that we need to take some of that benefit to actually invest in the complexity we are building by maybe converting some of the RPA automation into a more proper IT automation, because that is more stable. Also, as I touched upon, the maintenance mountain, having 300 processes in place means a lot of stakeholders to keep happy and interact with, but also updating the processes or the robots whenever something happens in the underlying IT applications. So we're focusing quite a lot on running the robots, but also maintaining them to make sure it runs smoothly. Also touched upon the downtime. You are dependent on those robots. You need to be aware of that and how to attack that if something happened. It wasn't a fun day, I think, when all of those 300 colleagues were sick. So we are trying not to take the most time-critical processes to robotize, because RPA isn't as stable as a sort of proper IT application. So you should be aware there is a risk of downtime. Of course, that also happens with IT or proper IT applications, but you're maybe more fragile with an RPA solution. And finally, as I've touched or talked about before, we have really focused on speed to be able to get the robot out in production and generating benefit. But we see that the bigger we're getting, we need to maybe shift a little bit from being super quick and so on to rather have it more structured, because that would help us with the maintenance, that would help us with the complexity, but also with the downtime. Hopefully no downtime, but if it happens. So we need to shift a little bit to be a little bit more structured and do it in a more structured way compared to getting it out there as quickly as possible. So that is sort of the short-term focus areas for us right now in robotics. But in general in Nordea, we would like to sort of take the next step in automation, and robotics, that is one tool in our automation toolbox. We want to add more to that toolbox. We are starting up a little bit. We have some sort of image analyzing capabilities. Kenneth touched upon that as well. That we see is a really good complement to, or an add-on to the robotics capability to be able to work with images, and also OCR to read text and so on. We also have a different part of the bank that is building our robot advisor. So that is basically the customer-facing smart advisor. So we want to connect with that one to be able to have the RPA robots to actually execute the orders that the customer-facing advisor, or robot in this case, are generating. So we're both trying to automate the front end and the back end with help of RPA and our Nora, as she's called. We're also trying with chatbots, as everyone, I think, or everyone wants to. We have them up and running in some countries in smaller pilots. And here's very much similar. We see this as the front end, interacting with the customer, being smart together with machine learning. And those two, or all of these, would be the ones sort of feeding the back end in terms of robotics to execute. So we very much see the robotics as the arms and legs executing, or the muscles that is executing, while this smart stuff with machine learning and chatbots and so on are the brain, if you can call it like that, that is feeding the arms and legs with the tasks or orders to execute on. So we really want to add all of these to our portfolio or to our toolbox, and then we see that we have a sort of intelligent automation and a good toolbox that can really help us taking the next step in automating in Nordea. I think that was it that we were planning to cover. I hope there's a ton of questions.